Imagine this. You're sitting in a classroom, expecting a regular day with a teacher you trust. A teacher whose job is to guide, educate, and inspire. But then, out of nowhere, this teacher crosses a line, one that no teacher should ever cross. They raise their voice and use a word loaded with history, pain, and hate, a word that echoes with centuries of suffering. What would you do in that moment? How would you feel if you, or someone you cared about, were the target of such a hurtful word? And what could possibly push a teacher, someone in a position of power and responsibility, to say something so shocking, so damaging, right in front of their students? But that's not all. Just moments after this disturbing outburst, something unexpected happens. The teacher receives a phone call. And what's said in that call? It changes everything. Today, we're diving into this story, a story of betrayal, accountability, and consequences. We'll uncover what led up to this explosive incident, how it impacted the student, and what happened after that call, a call that no one saw coming. By the end of this video, you'll understand not only the impact of this one moment, but also the ripple effects it had on the entire school and community. This story isn't just about one person's actions. It's about the power of words, the responsibility of authority figures, and how one moment can change everything. So stick around, because there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye, and you won't want to miss what happened next. We'll start with what happened in that classroom, where a regular school day turned into a moment that left students stunned. We'll walk through the shocking exchange between the teacher and the black student, exploring the emotions and reactions in the room. Then we'll get to the twist, the phone call that arrived just moments after the teacher's outburst. What was said in that call? Who was on the other end? And how did it affect the teacher, the student, and everyone who heard about it? Finally, we'll break down the aftermath, the consequences, the reactions, and the lessons this incident left behind. This story is more than just an incident. It's a reminder of the weight that words carry and the responsibility that comes with authority. This isn't just a story about a single word, a single action, or a single mistake. It's about understanding the power of words, the importance of respect, and the impact that authority figures have on young lives. Watching until the end will give you the full picture, a story that's both shocking and thought-provoking. And as we go through this story, ask yourself, how should teachers, mentors, and role models be held accountable when they cross the line? What kind of example do they set when their words harm instead of heal? Stay with us, because this story is one that everyone needs to hear. It all began as a regular school day. The classroom was buzzing with the sounds of students flipping through their textbooks, whispering to friends, and preparing for a typical lesson. The teacher, a figure who had been in the school for years, known and respected by most, stood at the front of the room. This was someone who students were supposed to trust, someone responsible for guiding and inspiring them. Among the students was a black teenager, sitting quietly, ready to learn. For him, this was just another day, one of countless days spent in the same classroom. But little did he know, this was about to become a day he would never forget. A small misunderstanding started between him and the teacher, something minor that could have been resolved with a few calm words. Perhaps he had missed a step in an assignment, or maybe he had asked a question the teacher found unnecessary. No one in the room thought much of it at first. It seemed like just an ordinary interaction. But as the conversation continued, something shifted. The teacher's tone grew sharper, more impatient. Her voice became louder, cutting through the classroom chatter. The students around her began to notice. They exchanged curious glances, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Was she really this upset over such a small thing? Why was she raising her voice? The black teenager tried to stay calm, tried to explain his side. But the teacher wouldn't hear it. Her frustration turned to anger, and her words became sharper, carrying an edge that was hard to ignore. The other students fell silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The tension in the room grew thick, a heavy silence pressing down on everyone. And then, in one terrible moment, it happened. The teacher yelled the N-word, a racial slur that carried the weight of centuries of pain and discrimination. It was a word that no one expected to hear, especially from someone in a position of authority. A word so loaded with history and hate that it seemed to hang in the air, echoing off the walls. The classroom froze. Every single student stared at the teacher, their faces a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fear. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. Could this really be happening? From their teacher, of all people. The black teenager, the target of the slur, sat in stunned silence, his face showing the pain and confusion that the word had caused. For him, it wasn't just a word. It was a reminder of a painful history, a history that he and so many others still feel today. Some students looked down, avoiding eye contact, as if they were trying to pretend they hadn't heard what they just heard. Others looked around the room, searching each other's faces for confirmation that this was real, that they weren't imagining it. A few students even began to record the scene on their phones, sensing that this moment was too significant to ignore. The teacher, on the other hand, didn't seem to realize the weight of what she had just done. Her face was still flushed with anger, her posture rigid and unyielding. It was as if she couldn't see the impact her words had had on the student, on the class, on everyone who had just witnessed this shocking outburst. The room was filled with a thick silence, a silence that was somehow louder than any words could have been. The black teenager, still in shock, finally looked away, his expression blank, almost numb. It was the look of someone who had been wounded, not just by a single word, but by the betrayal of trust. He had come to school to learn, to be part of a community, and instead, he had been made to feel small, hurt, and isolated, all because of one word from someone who should have known better. The other students remained silent, unsure of what to do or say. They were caught in a moment they didn't know how to handle, torn between their shock, their sympathy for their classmate, and their fear of speaking out. Some wanted to say something, to stand up for the student, but they didn't know how. They were young, and this was a situation no one had prepared them for. And as the seconds ticked by, the classroom remained trapped in that awful silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, their own reactions to what they had just witnessed. This was supposed to be a place of learning, a place of growth and support. But in that moment, it felt like anything but. No one knew it then, but this incident was just the beginning. The teacher's words would have consequences she never anticipated. The room was frozen in silence. Every student sat still, stunned by the teacher's outburst. The black teenager, who had been the target of her anger, remained quiet, his face reflecting a mix of shock and hurt. The air was thick with tension, and no one dared to move or make a sound. Just as the weight of the moment settled heavily on everyone, a sound broke the silence, the sudden ring of a phone. It startled the entire class, snapping them out of their shocked daze. Heads turned as the teacher looked down at her phone, her face still red from anger, her expression a mix of irritation and discomfort. She hesitated, staring at the screen for a moment as if deciding whether to answer or not. But something about that call seemed important. Maybe it was the timing, coming right after such a tense moment. Maybe it was the name on the caller ID. Reluctantly, she picked up the phone, her voice still sharp as she answered with a curt, "Hello." At first, her tone stayed the same, defensive, annoyed. But as the person on the other end spoke, the teacher's face began to change. Her brows knitted together, and her mouth fell slightly open, her expression shifting from irritation to confusion. She murmured a few words in response, but her tone had softened, almost as if she were no longer sure of herself. The students watched, curious but still tense, sensing that something significant was happening. They couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but they could see the effect it was having on the teacher. Bit by bit, her face lost its color. The anger drained away, replaced by a look of uncertainty. She glanced around the classroom, almost as if she was seeing the students for the first time since the outburst. Whatever was being said on that call, it was clear that it was serious. The teacher's body language had changed. Her posture, once rigid and forceful, began to slump. She took a shaky breath, her hand gripping the phone tightly as she listened, her eyes now filled with something like regret. The students could only guess at what the caller was saying, but they knew it had to be something important. For those watching, it was like seeing someone realize they'd made a terrible mistake, a mistake they couldn't take back. The look on her face was no longer one of authority, but of vulnerability. She wasn't the powerful teacher they knew anymore. In that moment, she looked almost afraid. One student, sitting near the front, caught a few faint words that the teacher spoke into the phone. "I understand. Yes, I realize. I'm so sorry." The words were whispered, barely audible, but they hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was clear that whoever was on the other end of the call was not happy with what they'd heard about the incident. Perhaps it was the school principal, or maybe even someone from the district office, someone who had learned about her outburst and was making it clear that her actions had serious consequences. As the teacher continued listening, her eyes flickered to the black student she had targeted. For a brief moment, her expression softened, but it was too late to take back what she had said. The damage had been done, and everyone in the room knew it. Her gaze lingered on the student, almost as if she wanted to say something, to explain, to apologize. But the words wouldn't come. The other students watching the scene unfold felt a strange sense of justice, mingled with unease. They'd just witnessed something rare, an adult in a position of power brought face to face with their own mistake, forced to confront the impact of their actions. The teacher, who had always seemed so confident, so in control, now looked small, almost lost. But the call wasn't over. Whoever was speaking to her wasn't letting her off easily. The teacher nodded along, her lips pressed tightly together, listening intently. Every now and then, she would mumble a yes or "I understand," her tone now filled with something like resignation. It was clear that she was being told something she didn't want to hear, something that might change the course of her career. The students didn't know exactly what was being said, but they could sense the gravity of the moment. The teacher looked as though she were carrying the weight of her actions, her earlier anger completely replaced by a sense of dread. This was more than just a reprimand. This was a reckoning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the call ended. The teacher slowly lowered the phone, staring at it in her hand as if it were some foreign object. She didn't speak. She didn't look up. For a few seconds, she just stood there, motionless, lost in thought. The classroom was dead silent, each student holding their breath, waiting to see what she would do next. She took a deep breath, visibly shaken, and finally looked up, meeting the eyes of her students. The confidence, the authority that once defined her was gone. In its place was a look of vulnerability, of uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to explain, to apologize, but no words came out. In that moment, she knew that the classroom had changed. The students no longer looked at her with respect or trust. She could see it in their eyes, the disappointment, the disapproval. She had crossed a line, and now she was left alone, standing in the aftermath of her own actions. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, until she finally turned, her shoulders slumped, and walked to her desk. She sat down, still holding her phone, and looked down at her hands. She looked, for the first time, truly unsure of herself. The students didn't move, didn't speak. They remained frozen, each one processing what they had just witnessed. The teacher, the one who was supposed to guide and lead them, had revealed a side of herself they had never expected to see. And now she was paying the price. The phone call had changed everything. It was as if a switch had flipped, and the powerful figure she once was had been replaced by someone else entirely. Someone humbled, someone afraid of what was to come next. The tension in the room was thick, and every student could feel it. They knew this wasn't over, that this moment would leave a lasting impact, not just on the teacher, but on everyone who had been there to witness it. As the days passed after that tense moment in the classroom, The echoes of what had happened continued to ripple through the school. The students who had been there couldn't shake off the memory, the shock of hearing such a hateful word from someone they were supposed to trust. It was a moment that left a mark on each one of them, a memory that now colored the way they viewed their teacher and even the school itself. The news of the incident spread quickly, as news always does in schools. Whispers and rumors filled the hallways, each student sharing their own version of the story, each retelling more dramatic than the last. Some students felt anger, others sadness, and a few even felt fear, wondering if their own teachers could one day use such hurtful words against them. But for the black student at the center of it all, the impact was deeply personal. This wasn't just a rumor or a shocking piece of gossip. It was something he carried with him, a memory that weighed heavily. How could he forget that moment? The betrayal of someone he was supposed to respect, someone who was supposed to be a role model. Now, every time he sat in that classroom, every time he looked at that teacher, he felt a sense of distrust, a wound that didn't show on the outside, but one that was raw, open, and painful. And what about the teacher? She was left to face the consequences of her own actions. There was talk that the administration had been involved after that mysterious phone call. Rumors swirled that she had been reprimanded, that she'd been called in for meetings, that she was under investigation. She began showing up to class more reserved, her confident demeanor replaced by a quiet, almost anxious air. She no longer made eye contact with her students, especially the black teenager she had hurt. Her once strong voice now wavered, her instructions delivered in a tone far softer, as if she were walking on eggshells. The students noticed this change, and while some thought it was a sign of guilt, others saw it as a loss of her authority. The respect she once commanded was no longer there. Every time she entered the room, a quiet tension followed her, as if the air grew heavier in her presence. The administration, meanwhile, tried to control the damage. The principal sent out a carefully worded email to students and parents, acknowledging that an incident had occurred and assuring everyone that steps were being taken to address it. But they avoided specifics, perhaps out of fear of backlash, or perhaps because they were unsure of how to handle a situation so charged, so sensitive. Some parents demanded answers, wanting to know how such an incident could happen under the school's roof. Other parents worried about the school's reputation, concerned about how this story would affect their children's sense of safety and trust in their teachers. For the students, though, no email or meeting could erase what they had witnessed. The classroom had changed for them. It was no longer a simple place of learning. It had become a place where they had seen the darker side of authority, where they'd learned that even teachers, the very people who teach right from wrong, could make serious mistakes. It was a lesson they hadn't signed up for, one that wasn't in any textbook, but one that left a deeper impact than any lesson plan ever could. Some students began to question the power that teachers held. They whispered among themselves, wondering if other teachers thought the same way, if they, too, harbored similar prejudices, but just hadn't shown them yet. Trust, once so easily given, was now harder to earn. The students who had once admired their teacher now looked at her with different eyes, eyes that had seen the cracks in her authority, eyes that had witnessed her weakness. For the teacher, the consequences of her words followed her like a shadow. Every glance, every whisper from her students felt like a reminder of her mistake. She tried to continue as usual, to move on, but every time she stood in front of the class, she could feel their silent judgment. It was as if her own classroom had turned against her, filled with the memories of that one terrible moment. She'd once stood confidently, an authority figure meant to guide and inspire. But now she felt like an outsider in her own space, a stranger who had lost the trust of those she was meant to lead. The impact didn't stop at her classroom, either. Teachers in the school were whispering too, worried about what had happened, wondering if they would be held to the same level of scrutiny. Some even felt a quiet relief. It wasn't them who'd made the mistake, but now they were watching their own words more carefully, aware of the eyes and ears of students who were, perhaps, seeing their teachers in a new light. The incident had left a ripple effect, one that stretched beyond the classroom, beyond that one teacher and student. It had left a mark on the school culture, on the way students viewed authority, on the trust that was once taken for granted. It was a lesson that no one had planned for, a lesson about the real-life consequences of words and actions. And it left everyone with questions that lingered, questions about accountability, respect, and the power of words. The incident didn't just stay within the walls of the classroom. Soon, word spread beyond the school grounds, spilling into the local community. Parents, friends, neighbors, everyone seemed to be talking about it. This was more than just school gossip now. It had become a topic of heated discussion throughout the town. People felt a need to weigh in, to question, to try and understand how something like this could happen in their own community. The news traveled fast. Parents of students who had been in the classroom began calling other parents, sharing what their children had told them, each retelling more shocking than the last. Stories circulated, and each person who heard it seemed to add their own thoughts, their own feelings about what the teacher had done. Some were furious, demanding answers, while others were simply in disbelief, struggling to reconcile this incident with the image they'd had of the school and its teachers. It wasn't long before the local media picked up the story. Reporters reached out to parents, students, and even teachers, hoping to get first-hand accounts. The headline painted a dramatic picture. Teacher uses racial slur against student. Community in shock. It was the kind of news that stirred strong emotions, sparking debates and conversations that quickly turned heated. For the parents of black students, the news hit hard. Many of them were already familiar with stories of discrimination and prejudice, but they never imagined it would happen so close to home, in a place meant to be safe. They felt a deep sense of anger and disappointment. Some felt compelled to speak out, attending school meetings and voicing their concerns. They wanted to know what steps the school would take to ensure this never happened again, not only to their children but to any student. They demanded change, real change, not just empty words and apologies. Some parents, however, worry about the impact on the school's reputation. They didn't want their children's school to be at the center of controversy. They feared that this incident would cast a shadow over the school, making it seem like a place where students weren't safe or respected. These parents quietly urged the administration to handle things quickly, to avoid making the issue bigger than it needed to be. But for others, especially the parents of the black students, this was a moment that needed to be confronted, not swept under the rug. The school administration found itself under intense pressure, trying to balance the different demands and concerns of the community. They held several meetings, some with parents, others with teachers and staff, and even a few with community leaders. But every meeting seemed to bring more questions than answers. How could they prevent such incidents in the future? What kind of training or policies could they put in place? And most importantly, how could they rebuild the trust that had been shattered? Inside the school, the atmosphere grew tense. Teachers became more guarded, speaking carefully, aware that any slip of the tongue could bring them under scrutiny. They felt as though they were walking on a tightrope, trying to avoid saying or doing anything that could be misunderstood. Some teachers resented this, feeling as though they were being unfairly judged for one person's mistake. Others, however, understood the need for change, feeling that this was a chance for the school to reflect on its culture, its values, and its commitment to respect and equality. The students, too, felt the impact of the incident in their daily lives. Conversations that had once been lighthearted and casual now turned serious, often touching on topics of race, respect, and authority. Some students felt emboldened, seeing this as an opportunity to speak up about their own experiences with prejudice, both in and out of school. Others, however, felt uncertain, unsure how to navigate these discussions without risking backlash or misunderstanding. The black student at the center of the incident was perhaps the most affected. In the days following, he became the subject of countless conversations and whispers as classmates, teachers, and even strangers looked at him with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. Some of his friends rallied around him, offering support, while others seemed uncomfortable, unsure of what to say. The attention was overwhelming, and he found himself feeling isolated, as though he had become a symbol rather than a person. But he wasn't the only one under the spotlight. The teacher's name was known throughout the community, her actions dissected by strangers who had never met her. Some people defended her, saying it was a mistake, a momentary lapse of judgment. Others were less forgiving, calling for her to be removed from her position, arguing that a person who could use such hurtful words had no place in the classroom. The community was divided, torn between forgiveness and accountability, between moving forward and addressing the deep-rooted issues this incident had brought to light. Local leaders and activists began to weigh in, some even organizing forums and events to discuss the broader issues of racism and discrimination in schools. For them, this was a chance to bring about real change, to address problems that often went unspoken, hidden beneath the surface. The school board was now in a position where they had to make a choice. Would they take strong action, showing that they were committed to upholding a standard of respect and equality? Or would they choose a quieter path, trying to move past the incident without fully addressing its impact? Parents, students, and community members watched closely, waiting to see how the administration would respond. For the students, this was a defining moment, a lesson far more profound than anything they had learned in textbooks. It showed them that words have power, that respect and empathy are not just abstract concepts, but vital principles that need to be practiced every day. It taught them that authority figures are not immune to mistakes, and that when those in power cross a line, they must be held accountable. In the weeks that followed the incident, the question on everyone's mind was simple but powerful. What now? What would the school do to ensure this never happened again? And how would the students, the teachers, and the entire community move forward after such a painful event? The path forward wasn't clear, but it was certain that things couldn't go back to the way they were before. The school administration knew they had to make changes, not just for show, but for real. The trust had been broken, and to rebuild it would take more than just apologies and meetings. They needed to show that they were serious about addressing the problem at its core. It wasn't enough to tell students to be respectful or to remind teachers of professional boundaries. This was bigger than that, and everyone knew it. The first step was accountability. The teacher was put on administrative leave, a decision that sparked mixed reactions. Some believed it was the right call, a necessary move to show that there were consequences for such actions. Others, however, questioned if it was enough. Would a suspension truly address the harm done? And what message would it send if, after a short time away, the teacher was allowed to return to her classroom as if nothing had happened? While on leave, the teacher was required to attend training sessions meant to make her aware of the weight her words carried and the responsibility that came with her position. For her, it was a humbling experience, a harsh reminder of the impact of her actions. She attended sessions on cultural sensitivity, on understanding the history behind the words she had used, and on recognizing the hurt that language can cause. But even as she participated in these sessions, she knew that regaining her students' trust, if that was even possible, would be a long journey. The school didn't stop there. They knew that one person's actions reflected a larger issue, one that couldn't be ignored. They brought in specialists to hold workshops for both students and teachers. These workshops were different from the typical respect everyone talks they'd had in the past. This time, they dug deeper. They addressed the uncomfortable topics, the history of racial slurs, the impact of prejudice in everyday interactions, and the hidden biases that even well-meaning people can carry. The goal wasn't to shame anyone but to open eyes, to make everyone, especially the teachers, aware of the power they held and the trust they were given. For the students, these sessions were eye-opening. They listened, they learned, and many found themselves reflecting on their own experiences. Some students, particularly those who had felt marginalized, shared their stories. They talked about the subtle moments of bias they'd faced, the small comments that had stung, but that they'd brushed off, thinking it wasn't worth causing trouble. But now, they realized that these small moments added up, creating an environment that could sometimes feel hostile or unwelcoming. The administration also introduced a new program, something they called Safe Voices. This program allowed students to report any incidents of discrimination or unfair treatment anonymously, giving them a platform to speak up without fear of retaliation. It was a small step, but for many students, it felt like a lifeline. They finally had a way to express their concerns, to voice their discomfort, without the risk of being singled out. As these changes were introduced, the community watched closely. Parents, especially those who had been vocal about the incident, attended the workshops and listened to the new policies the school was putting in place. Some felt hopeful, seeing these actions as a sign that the school was taking responsibility. Others remained skeptical, wondering if these changes would last or if, once the memory of the incident faded, things would return to the way they had been. Meanwhile, the black student who had been at the center of it all found himself caught between feelings of relief and exhaustion. He appreciated the changes, the acknowledgement of his experience, but he couldn't help feeling tired. Tired of being the one who had to endure the pain for change to happen. He had become a symbol in the eyes of many, a representation of the need for progress. But to him, it was personal, not just a lesson for others. Every time he walked into the classroom, he felt the weight of that day, the memory still fresh, a wound that hadn't fully healed. For his friends and classmates, it was a time of reflection. Some realized that they had never truly understood the struggles their friend and other black students faced daily. They had always thought of racism as something distant, something that happened elsewhere, not in their own school, not with people they knew. But now, they saw things differently. They began to question the small things, the jokes they had once laughed at, the stereotypes they had let slide. It was a time of growing awareness, of learning to see things from a perspective they had never considered before. The teacher, too, was on a journey of her own. She knew that even if she returned to her position, things would never be the same. She could no longer walk into a classroom and assume respect. She would have to earn it back, one step at a time. The training sessions had changed her, made her see the impact of her words in a way she hadn't before. But would her students ever forgive her? Could she regain their trust? Only time would tell. As the weeks turned into months, the school slowly adapted to its new reality. The changes became part of the daily routine, the workshops, the Safe Voices program, the continued discussions about respect and understanding. The incident that had started it all became a memory, but one that lingered, serving as a reminder of the consequences of a single moment, a single word.